Hello, I'm Mark Clarkson. This video provides a conspectus of my submission to the Commonwealth of Australia Parliament Joint Standing Committee on Trade and Investment Growth inquiry into Australia's transition to a green energy superpower. The link to the submission published on ResearchGate is below this video. The submission may be published by the committee during 2023 after it individually considers what the committee describes as a large number of submissions. My submission is 152 pages long and over 50,000 words, so this video presentation may serve as an overview for those not immediately excited by the prospect of wading through the full text of the submission. You should say Australia's transition to a green energy superpower very quickly. It does roll off the tongue somewhat elegantly, but the thoughtful amongst the electorate might think that it's just a little too oily and has all the hallmarks of what Australians have come to accept as political spin. Section 2 of the submission considers the political triggers for a transition to a green energy superpower on a global basis, because the transition to green energy is a global movement. So where did the incentives for this global movement come from? As Section 2 of the submission explains, in 1991, United Nations, UN, apparatchik Maurice Strong became responsible for organising the first ever international UN conference on the human environment, held in Stockholm in June 1972. The UN Environment Programme, UNEP, was born at this conference, and Strong was appointed its first Secretary General. In 1994, Maurice Strong and Mikhail Gorbachev co-authored and launched the Earth Charter, which sets out the basic principles to guide the conduct of nations and peoples towards each other and towards the planet. It was less a package of solutions than a set of moral, spiritual, and ethical principles for the care of the earth, which Strong hoped would become like the Ten Commandments, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a symbol of the aspirations and commitments of people everywhere. Mikhail Gorbachev, you might ask? Yes, that Mikhail Gorbachev, Secretary General of the USSR Communist Party Central Committee, 1985 to 1991, and the first and only president of the former Soviet Union, 1990 to 91. The Green Movement grew from there. As the sun was setting on the former Soviet Union, plans were developed for a new world order, a communist rebirth, with a restructuring of the global economy. In 1989, the Governing Council of the UNEP resolved to convene a UN conference on environment and development. The 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro was convened by UN resolution. Many of the delegates, including Fidel Castro, believed that the mantra of sustainability and decarbonisation would shepherd in a new world order based on fundamental communist precepts under the umbrella of the United Nations. Again, yes, that Fidel Castro. The final text of Agenda 21, the UN blueprint for socio-economic development for the 21st century, was the result of the drafting, consultation and negotiation which began in 1989 and which was completed at the two-week Earth Summit Conference. Agenda 21 might be regarded as the 21st century version of Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, but under the guise and disguise of caring for the environment. The preamble adumbrates a call to arms by the faltering forces of international communism. Those promoting Agenda 21 have called it a perfectly sensible planning paper. Marx and Engels probably thought the Communist Manifesto was also a perfectly sensible planning paper. During the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl extended an invitation to hold the first session of the Conference of the Parties, COP1, in Berlin. The UN General Assembly accepted that invitation, and COP1 was held from 28th of March 1995 to 7th of April 1995. Angela Merkel was then the German Minister for the Environment. In her welcoming speech to the first session at COP1, it was apparent that Angela Merkel had already bought into and was promoting the climate change mantra, inter alia saying that climate protection is one of the greatest challenges for present and future environmental policy. If no measures are taken, it is estimated that the average temperature of the Earth's lower atmosphere will rise by 3 degrees Celsius, plus or minus 1.5 degrees Celsius, by the end of the next century. The repercussions of such a rise would be dramatic: a shift in climatic and vegetation zones, a change in rainfall distribution, and a worsening of the global food situation. It was not the first time this mantra would be expressed by politicians, and certainly not the last. Angela Merkel was educated under the communist East German Democratic Republic, the DDR. She's fluent in German and Russian, the latter a mandatory skill in the DDR. She met her first husband, Ulrich Merkel, a physics student, during an exchange trip to Moscow and Leningrad. She later married Joachim Sauer, a chemistry professor. As a teenager, Merkel was a member of the East German Communist Youth Organization, or Free German Youth. The German Green Party traces its origins to the student protest movement of the 1960s, the environmental movement of the 1970s, and the peace movement of the early 1980s. The more recent manifestation, Alliance 90/The Greens, was formed in 1993 after the merger of the Greens, formed in West Germany in 1980, and Alliance 90, formed in East Germany in 1990. The Greens had itself merged with the East German Green Party after German reunification in 1990. The Australian Greens take their inspiration from the German Greens. The broader Green movement is a loose concatenation of academics, lecturers, teachers, environmentalists, scientists, political activists, concerned citizens, and ambitious politicians. Within this great movement are a number of different entities with different constitutions, members, and objectives. In some countries, the Green movement is comprised of underground groups. In other polities, they have entered mainstream politics. Like in the early days of communism, the broader Green movement has become very adept at propaganda. Everyone in the public at large must accept the science behind their demands for climate change remediation, even if that science is only expressed in alarmist conclusions. Anyone asking for the data or otherwise questioning the science is decried and bullied into submission. In that regard, the broader Green movement has also taken a leaf from communist regimes who continuously hold the spectre of the Gulag and re-education camps over anyone questioning the righteousness of the communist model or daring to suggest that it was not actually working in the manner the communist leadership pretended. There is a deliberate and well-crafted strategy to teach climate change science as if it was a new religion. It starts in kindergarten and is otherwise present at all levels within the school system, where even doctoral students at university express what they think is a well-founded fear that the Earth will fry like Venus. The members of the modern environmental push do not mind being called socialists. They embrace the term and speak of environmental justice, climate change justice. These incentives seem to broadly follow the greening of the campus practice of verbally and non-verbally supporting pro-environmental activities among their students, faculty members and staff, playing an important leadership role in the promotion of sustainable development by using relation strategies to promote sustainability across multiple campus groups and departments by recruiting campus ambassadors, collectively defining sustainability and sharing public progress reports. Wood et al. 2016 see the move from greening the campus to greening the ivory tower as the next challenge. It was only after Angela Merkel was no longer German Chancellor that the legacy of her reign could be critically examined. Recent critiques show a great disconnect between what Merkel said as Green Chancellor and what was actually happening in Germany in relation to energy. Reworking the German Energy Mix 2021, shown in the DW graph reproduced on page 20 of my submission, shows that in 2021, around half of German electricity came from other than renewables. 20% from brown coal mined in Germany, 10% from hard coal, largely imported, 10% from natural gas, mostly imported, 9% from biomass, largely produced in Germany. The other half came from renewables, 13% from nuclear power, 4% from hydropower, 10% from solar, and 23% from wind. In 2021, Germany imported 52.4 terawatt hours of electricity and exported 71.6 terawatt hours. The war in the Ukraine highlighted the fact that Germany had become dependent on Russia to some extent for its energy needs. About half the hard coal imported and most of the natural gas imported for electricity generation came from Russia. Germany also imported natural gas from Russia for domestic and industrial consumption not related to the generation of electricity. Not often highlighted is the fact that brown coal mined in Germany still produces 20% of the electricity generated. The dependency on Russian coal and gas has led to the reopening of German coal-fired power stations and new restrictions on the consumption of gas. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, a former president of the International Union of Socialist Youth, appears to have had the same training in the art of propaganda Angela Merkel enjoyed in the East German Communist Youth Organization. Firstly, Ardern adopted the Green Left policy of proscribing new offshore oil and gas exploration and extraction in New Zealand, believing that the world had enough supplies. That grand 2018 policy announcement was later exposed as mere propaganda when it was revealed that the New Zealand government continued to grant permits onshore, despite the fact that 6 months before granting the permits, the government had declared a national climate emergency. Jacinda Ardern said at that time that the declaration was an acknowledgement of the next generation, an acknowledgement of the burden that they will carry if we do not get this right and do not take action now. The Merkel disconnect between grand policy announcements in harmony with Green Left policies and the reality on the ground is only too apparent. In an effort to explain away the disconnect, Ardern resorted to the buzzwords just transition, saying that it was a substantial decision to take away offshore, and of course now our focus is that just transition around onshore, so that's the next process for us. What does it all mean? It is a pitch ad captandum vulgus designed to ensure that adoring crowds of voters continue to allow the purveyors of propaganda to remain in office. It otherwise means whatever the purveyor wants it to mean from time to time, a flexible, variable type of gobbledygook, allowing the purveyors to continue in office without any accountability for their actual policies can have drastic consequences for any economy over which they rule. New Zealand now imports all of its transport fuels. The limited New Zealand indigenous crude production from the Taranaki oil fields is the so-called light and sweet crude, which is exported, commanding good prices. The heavy crude for the Marsden Point refinery was mostly imported. That refinery has now been closed. The 1,000 megawatt Huntly Thermal Power Station was built on the lower Waikato River from 1973 to 1983. It is the largest thermal power station in New Zealand. It generates more electricity than all the hydroelectric schemes on the Waikato River combined. It is operated by Genesis Energy Limited, a public listed company 51% owned by the New Zealand government. The power station was developed in harmony with the policy of the day to locate coal-fired thermal power stations next to thermal coal fields to provide the coal, and rivers to provide the water for steam generation. The Huntly coalfields were mined by Solid Energy Limited, a New Zealand state-owned enterprise formed from the Government Department State Coal Mines. Like in New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland, state-owned coal mines supplied coal for state-owned coal-fired power generators. In each of those polities, it was a system that worked well until it didn't anymore. The power stations and the coal mines were progressively sold off either to semi-government autonomous institutions or to the private sector. The Huntly power station was originally designed to run on coal. In 2004, the power station was upgraded with the addition of a 50 megawatt gas turbine plant. And in 2007, the combined cycle gas turbine plant was commissioned. The new turbines increased the total installed capacity to 1453 megawatts. The two 250 megawatt units were constructed as dual fuel, able to operate on natural gas from Taranaki or coal from the nearby coal mine. The gas was transmitted along a 370 kilometre, 750 millimetre diameter Maui gas pipeline from a production station which was commissioned in 1979 to supply the station. Because the Ardern government proscribed new offshore gas development, when the Maui gas ran out, the Huntly power station was converted back to coal, but not the high-quality thermal coal from the shuttered Huntly coalfields. New Zealand now imports coal for the Huntly power station, mainly from Indonesia, with much of it coming to Huntly by truck from the ports of Auckland, while some comes by rail from the port of Tauranga. The dirty, sulphur-ridden, high-ash coal that even China will not use. Genesis Energy must be concerned about these matters, noting that global warming is an issue for the planet. They are excited to be trialling biomass at Huntly, substituting burning coal and gas and using a renewable source. No doubt in the green left speak of our days, Genesis Energy will be claiming that burning vast quantities of emissions-producing biomass produces a green, renewable, sustainable form of energy. After all, it worked for Angela Merkel. It will probably not occur to anyone that thermal coal is really just biomass compressed and heated over millennia by natural forces, or that burning thermal coal produces a much lower volume of emissions and produces vastly better BTU per tonne burnt than biomass could ever hope to achieve. But it appears to remain all about the propaganda. Keeping the slogans short, making them easy to chant seems to help. 4 legs good, 2 legs better. Section 3 of the submission deals with the scientific basis of the political call for a transition to green energy. In the face of the fact that global temperatures peaked in 2016, plateaued, then fell, and are still falling, while CO2 levels continue to rise exponentially, it takes a certain mindset impervious to logical reason to continue to push the line that the loosely defined emissions need to be curtailed in order to save the planet. A critical examination of what is posited as science makes two things abundantly clear. CO2 does not cause global warming. Even if it was possible, which is doubtful, reducing emissions will not cool the planet. Indeed, reducing visible pollution and sulfur dioxide emissions may actually be counterproductive. Section 4 of the submission deals with the Australian triggers for a political call for a transition to green energy. Bob Brown and Drew Hutton co-founded the Australian Greens. Drew Hutton wrote a book explaining that green politics is the new synthesis, both philosophically and organisationally, which Marx and traditional left groups are unable to provide. He avoided using the word communist. It's no longer fashionable to do so. However, green ideology goes beyond mere environmentalism, or what the late Jack Munday, then General Secretary of the BLF, described as ecological Marxism. Agenda 21 is notionally implemented in Australia under the Paul Keating Australian Labor Party era 1992 Intergovernmental Agreement on the Environment and the National Strategy for Ecologically Sustainable Development. But there was no immediate rush to shut down mining, oil and gas, or a feverish push demanding that all electricity be generated by renewable energy. There was very much a business as usual approach to what was apparently regarded as just another international agreement, which Australia had executed on the international stage, but which did not demand that anything radically change domestically. This approach needs some explanation. Firstly, although the ALP was originally constituted and empowered by unions with roots deeply embedded in communist ideology, the 1955 split between the Roman Catholics and the communists in the ALP led to the formation of the Roman Catholic-dominated Democratic Labour Party, the DLP. Reconciliation in the early 1970s led the Whitlam ALP federal election victory in 1972, after which it is said the DLP imploded. However, the better view may be that once the Roman Catholics controlled the ALP, they did not need the DLP as a separate political party. The ALP of the Hawke-Keating era was tempered by right-leaning influences of the Roman Catholics and became fiercely anti-communist. Then, whilst Australia is a signatory to many international instruments, including those dealing with climate change and UN treaties and conventions dealing with human rights, and urges other countries to adopt all of the above as part of their domestic law, as Mason Chief Justice and McHugh Justice point out in Dietrich and McQueen, following the earlier decision in Bradley in the Commonwealth, without specific local enabling legislation, these international agreements and instruments are not part of Australian domestic law. In Australia, these international instruments are usually just ignored. Although the Australian Commonwealth has the legislative capacity to make things inspired by them part of domestic law, it really does so. Certainly, both the Coalition and ALP seem to regard the calls for a radical redesigning of the Australian economy to phase out coal, oil and gas and adopt incentives mandating electricity generated only by renewable energy as a push by the radical green left, which they should humour rather than implement. The increasingly alarmist predictions of the IPCC, which the Greens fervently promote, did not seem to impress either the Coalition or the ALP as being scientifically based. So, what changed the traditional two-party vote distribution? The answer, simply put, is the electoral success of the Greens and the Teals. Doff Dickinson, from the perhaps appropriately named agency Brains, led what on any measure rates as one of the most successful marketing stories of recent years, the Teal brand that she conceived for Zali Steggall's 2019 campaign against Tony Abbott in the Sydney seat of Ringa. While the financing for the Australian Greens as a registered political party may always remain somewhat obscure, the bankrolling of the electoral campaigns mounted by the Teals can be ascertained by the public announcements made by relevant stakeholders. Climate 200, the unregistered political party run by renewables billionaire and perhaps lobbyist Simon Holmesaccord, appears to have decimated the ranks of all the major parties by spending only $6 million, topped up by other donations from the likes of Atlassian co-founders Scott Farquhar and Mike Cannon-Brookes, and Alex Turnbull, the son of former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, to generate an aggregate, say, $12 million. However, it does not appear to be all about the aggregate volume of spending, but how the funds available are distributed to individual candidates in individual seats. If the coalition and Australian Labor are to survive, they need to engage more with their candidates at the seat level and spend the available money wiser, smarter and better. The success in the federal election was not entirely duplicated in the 26 November 2022 Victorian state election. Climate 200 backed independent candidates in Hawthorn, Kew, Mornington and Caulfield. Simon Holmesaccord said, "The election result was amazing given that public funding flows to incumbents in advance, making it difficult for an independent to break into Victorian politics. That result allowed Teal candidates to come within a few votes of success in many seats, and their campaign and polling must have scared the pants off many candidates from traditional parties, including former senior Liberal front bench John Pesciuto, who scraped into the seat of Hawthorn to become the Victorian leader of the opposition." No one should believe for a moment that all of the donations to Climate 200, or by those sharing their Weltanschauung, came with no strings attached, as Simon Holmesaccord claimed before the last federal election. Each of the donators has vested financial interests in renewable energy that can only become really viable if they first cauterise coal, oil and gas electricity generation and force the end consumer to pay the inflated price attached to renewable energy, cast free of its significantly cheaper fossil fuel competitors. Section 4 concludes with some observations on the roles of unregistered political parties and lobbyists in Australia, their funding of political campaigns and their use of social media to secure the electoral outcomes they desire. Section 5 deals with the political landscape in Gladstone and central Queensland. Once upon a time, a travelling political roadshow came to Gladstone, the port city in central Queensland. Many eminent people came from the nation's capitals to impress the locals. They foretold of the riches to be gained from a great new industry called green hydrogen. This industry, the locals were told, would be based in Gladstone and export billions of dollars of green hydrogen to an energy-starved world. The locals were told that thousands of new jobs would be created in the region to service this booming new industry. The locals were amazed. They had heard so many stories in the past about boom times to come. Often booms did come, followed by the bust. Green hydrogen should be regarded as political hydrogen, the new nitrous oxide. Those inhaling it tend to become dizzy and lightheaded. But fairy floss never lasts long on the stick once you leave the fairground. By June 2022, there were no further milestones to celebrate, and the Queensland Government website for the Green Hydrogen Project referred those seeking further information to the Australian Gas Network's website. That, in turn, merely noted that current work is focused on securing the site, achieving the development approvals, and appointing partners to commence construction. This is apparently how green hydrogen ends, not with a bang, but a whimper, with apologies to T.S. Eliot. Section 6 of the submission deals with the technical and engineering challenges any transition to green energy will face, and which do not appear to have been seriously considered. Somewhat belatedly, renewable energy purveyors seem to have realised that it's necessary to build a transmission grid from their new facilities to the existing transmission grid in order to deliver power to consumers. However, the greater the distance between the source of the electricity generated and the location of the consumer using the electricity, the greater the transmission and distribution loss. Over the entire network, transmission loss accounts for approximately 17% of electricity generated, while distribution loss is approximately 50%. This is an aggregate 67%. In Queensland, for the state-owned Ergon Energy TUOS3 West region, the loss factor was 1.5443. To put that in perspective, in that region, to deliver enough energy to power 100,000 homes, Ergon Energy needs to transmit enough energy to power 154,430 homes. Why is that important? Renewable energy power generation facilities like solar and wind tend to be a long, long way from consumers. To add to the transmission problems, in many Australian polities, the poles and wires of the transmission grids were sold off to private equity. Those deals are predicated on the new private equity owners enjoying a minimum cash flow based upon minimum transmission volumes. In these policies, the existing transmission grid cannot just be scrapped once coal-fired power is shut down. It's not a case of just abandoning the old transmission grid and building a new one. It's a case of building the new transmission grid and then buying back the old one because the default provisions in the sale agreements demand that course. Given the billions achieved on their sale, the buyback will not be cheap. Section 7 of the submission deals with the legislative and regulatory challenges facing the Australian transition to a green energy superpower. The problem with having a legislative scheme tilted against mining, oil and gas and agricultural developments, coupled with inferior courts and tribunals otherwise charged with decision-making processes in relation to mining, oil and gas and agriculture, being infected with green left mantra, is that the regime created by a concatenation of the legislature, regulator and inferior courts and tribunals may cauterise solar and wind farm developments simply because they all fall under the same regime. Further agreements and legislation between the Commonwealth states and territories may be necessary in order to ensure that the regulatory regime for these new resources treats them with special favour. God forbid that they were treated as if they were coal mines. Section 8 of the submission deals with the transition of Queensland to a green energy superpower. Similar problems may be faced by other polities seeking to follow Queensland in this quest. One of the problems is that when the state is the resource proponent, the resource operator and the resource regulator, the approvals process, ownership of the resource, conduct of the operations and the regulation of the operations are all controlled by the state. There is no contradictor or balancing process. State Queensland negotiates what is effectively a state agreement with State Queensland. There may at best only be go through the motions consultations with stakeholders impacted by the developments. The old adage that you do not have to let people have their way, just have their say, may be translated into only sufficient meetings with the local communities to provide a base for Queensland State to say it broadly consulted with a wide range of stakeholders. then doing precisely what it intended to do before the consultations. It is already notable that for the approval of the renewable energy projects which it wants to develop, own and operate, State Queensland as a renewable energy proponent does not appear to have followed the schema developed for applications to State Queensland as renewable energy regulator. Moreover, that loose confederation of environmental activist protest groups who conduct lawfare to raise every nitpicking point possible in order to confute the approvals process for any project remotely involving fossil fuels will broadly support any project involving any form of renewable energy, including clear-felling forests to produce biomass. Few will lock the gate to stop those seeking to erect wind turbines or install solar panels. Not much prospect of any renewable energy proponent, including State Queensland, enduring the decade-long lawfare crimped approvals process reputedly costing over $1 billion endured by the Adani Carmichael coal mine, or the 15-year delay endured by New Hope for their New Acland coal mine. Inferior courts and tribunals, including the Queensland Land Court, now charged with regulating and managing state agreements and resource projects otherwise approved under general legislative provisions, who impeach resource projects on the basis of their contribution to Tier 1, Tier 2 and Tier 3 emissions, will remain silent. There is little prospect that anyone in the hierarchy of decision makers will refuse to approve wind or solar farms on the basis that unacceptable levels of Great Barrier Reef destroying emissions are produced during the manufacture of the component parts, their shipping to Australia, transportation to site, erection and installation, ongoing operations or maintenance. Few protest renewable energy developments on these grounds. Most protests against renewable energy developments are localised and related to noise, adverse visual impacts and land clearing. There has been a recent protest from farmers at Beelawela in central Queensland complaining that new transmission lines designed to connect a new wind farm to the national grid will adversely impact upon their capacities to conduct cropping operations. But these complaints are rare and usually trampled underfoot. There is also every danger that the wishes of local communities where solar and wind farms are installed and operated will be trampled under the enthusiastic rush to embrace renewable energy. No one is likely to consider the immediate danger that clearing the sites for solar and wind farms will have on the habitat of rare and endangered species, let alone the adverse effects of all these activities may have on the Great Barrier Reef. The habitat of the rare and endangered ornamental snake and yakka skink may get bulldozed along with the critical habitat of the black-throated finch. After all, the fate of these creatures was only raised to defeat coal mines. Their demise should never prevent a renewable energy project from proceeding. In addition, well-qualified and experienced executives are becoming quite unwilling to take up the helm at companies involved in any operations of which the Green Left do not approve. Recently, AGL CEO Brett Redman resigned because he was unable to make the long-term commitment to the radical plan adopted by the board to move away from coal to green power. Tech billionaire and renewables investor Mike Cannon-Brookes has since installed directors committed to a rapid move away from coal to renewables. Section 9 of the submission deals with the plight of rural and regional communities. Most of the political power in Australia resides in the capital cities, and as noted above in Section 4, increasingly this political power is wielded by the Greens and the Teals. Most of the power generated as electricity resides in rural and regional areas and is transmitted from rural and regional areas to capital cities. As noted below, most of that power is generated by fossil fuels in regional and rural Australia. There are no coal mines, oil or gas wells in the Melbourne, Sydney or Brisbane suburbs where the Greens and the Teals live, nor do they live next to coal, oil or gas-fired electric power generators. Even if the majority of power in Australia is generated by renewable energy, it will be generated in rural and regional Australia and transmitted to the Melbourne, Sydney or Brisbane suburbs where the Greens and the Teals live. They would never permit solar or wind farms in their neighbourhoods. Oh, but they might say, I have solar panels on my roof. The reality, as is shown by the graph on page 104 of my submission, is that rooftop solar generates a very small part of Australian electricity requirements. And throughout Australia, mains power is still largely produced by fossil fuel electric generators. Fossil fuels contributed 71% of total electricity generation in 2021, including coal 51%, gas 18%, and oil 2%. The electricity generation fuel mix in the states and territories is dealt with on page 105 of my submission. Section 10 of the submission deals with the conclusion. Section 11 with the recommendations. There are 17 of them, and I propose to read them in full. 1. The cost to the taxpayers that the subsidies and tax breaks needed require, and the cost to the ultimate consumer of the energy generated by just transition technologies be calculated and published. Number 2, Australia critically evaluates the history and consequences of the policies of Angela Merkel in Germany and the EU and of Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. Number 3, Australia critically evaluates the science behind the calls for carbon abatement. 4, Australia does not make policy based on the urge incumbent governments often feel to remain in power. If any politician feels that their only goal in office is to remain in office, it's time for them to leave. 5, that unregistered political parties be proscribed and new laws prescribe that all associations of persons united in a common political push must be registered as political parties and regulated as such. 6, that the rule that no one other than a registered political party can endorse candidates or members on any paperwork distributed during the election process be extended to include posts on social media. 7, that the rules relating to the registration and regulation of lobbyists operating in the Australian Commonwealth states and territories be strengthened to better include those seeking to influence candidates for office. 8, that new rules be formulated relating to the registration and regulation of campaign funding operating in the Australian Commonwealth states and territories to include those providing electoral funding for candidates for office. 9, that new rules be formulated relating to the registration and regulation of campaign funders operating in the Australian Commonwealth states and territories to demand that all campaign funders provide a list of their vested interests and declare any conflicts of interest that may have caused them to promote and fund any candidate. 10, that Australia conduct a feasibility study into the vices and virtues of small modular nuclear reactors, considering their application to the Australian energy crisis and their role in the just transition away from fossil fuel powered generation. 11, that Australia reject the use of biomass as a fuel source for the generation of electricity. 12, that in harmony with the states and territories, the Australian Commonwealth enact a bespoke regulatory regime dedicated to renewable energy projects that includes provisions for access agreements, native title and indigenous rights, hazard assessment and management, and hydrogen as a fuel gas. 13, that in harmony with the states and territories, the Australian government enact a bespoke regulatory regime that contains and regulates protests, lawfare, against renewable energy projects. 14. That in harmony with the states and territories, the Australian government enact a bespoke regulatory regime for renewable energy projects under a new independent entity that regulates the approvals process, ownership of the resource, conduct of the operations, and the regulation of operations, and which provides for mandatory consultation with affected stakeholders. 15. That in harmony with the states and territories, the Australian Commonwealth prescribes the competencies required for all roles in renewable energy operations and creates a new education program to become the standard under which the skills and training are provided for workers in renewable energy to meet the prescribed competencies. 16. That in harmony with the states and territories, the Australian Commonwealth prescribes an education program to meet with and fully inform rural and regional Australian communities as to what precisely the just transition to renewables will mean, and in particular, precisely which coal and gas facilities will be outlawed and shuttered, and which rural and regional communities will be shut down. That in harmony with the states and territories, the Australian Commonwealth prescribes a compensation program to fully compensate rural and regional Australian communities adversely affected by the just transition to renewables, and in particular, precisely what each worker presently employed in coal and gas will receive for the loss of their livelihoods, and what they will receive for their home, if they own one, and what relocation allowance they will receive when rural and regional communities are shuttered. Thank you.